Hey everyone, welcome to a new week of craziness in our computer systems and society and everything involved in 2020. Hopefully, this is all clear to you, and just let me know if you have any questions. Again, because email is down, you can still Zoom or use the phone number to send me text messages or calls and just still reach out for help as you need it, and we'll be patient and work together as we move forward. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of a system. And a system is a word used in science where because the universe is so big, the universe is so complicated, one way of dealing with that is focusing our attention onto just a limited number of things. And what we focus on are going to be a system. So it's a set of things that are somehow separate from the environment. So, for example, the cardiovascular system in our bodies is the system that is made of our heart and lungs and blood vessels, and it's what moves it's a system that's moving our blood and oxygen, but it's not talking about the rest of our body. It's not necessarily talking about our muscles or our brain or our bones. Okay, so it's focusing in on this part of what we are. Now, can a system really exist totally free of everything else? No. But it's just a way of saying, okay, we're going to focus in on this and see how this works in relation to the environment, everything else around it. So in this case, the cardiovascular system, the environment, the thing that it's separated from, would be the other organs of the body. So like the stomach acids or the brain or whatever. Another example of a system you could have would be a stove and pot system. So you have a pot on the stove and you limit what you're talking about to just that. So whatever is in that pot, on that pot, in that stove, and not worrying about the rest of the house, not worrying about any other dishes, not worrying about the cook, where you're just focusing on an imaginary world where that's all that exists, or where you're focusing on that. Um, and another that we're going to be using is the Earth system. So looking at the Earth as its kind of own thing, and um, and it being separated from the moon, being a separate thing from the solar system, from the rest of the universe. So the Earth we're going to see as its own thing, and so we're going to consider things like the sun as outside of that. So when we talk about the Earth, we're not including the sun in that. The sun is something that affects the Earth, but it's not part of the Earth. And this, it's made up of some words that you want to know is the atmosphere. So atmosphere is going to be the sphere, the area of the air around us. And then the hydrosphere is going to be the area of the water. And then the geosphere is going to be the area of the rock or the ground that we're on, geos. So that's what we're going to be focusing in on. So there's this conflict between words and figuring out, okay, what does separate really mean? So, for example, we can see the stars, we can see the sun. So, are we really separate from them? Because obviously the sun affects us. Obviously, if you see something, it can affect you in some way, but it's not really with you. So, are we separate? Yes or no or in between? What is this? And so we're gonna in our discussion of it, we're gonna focus on the idea of an open system and a closed system. And the way I want you to think about these things is that an open system, we're gonna define what we're talking about. So are we talking about energy? Are we talking about matter? What are we talking about? And so for whatever we're talking about, if the thing can go in or out of our system, we're going to call it open. If it can go in and out, it's open. Um, and so the system is affected by the environment. So if you're talking about light, if it's an open system related to light, then it can be affected by the environment's light. Um, And in open systems in general, energy is always going to be an open system thing because we just can't stop energy in real life in practical matters. Energy is going to flow in or out. There's not really any way to stop that. And then sometimes, depending on the system, sometimes matter will. So sometimes you have systems where you can stop things like molecules from leaving, and some systems you can't. So if the molecules are leaving and coming in and going out, we would consider that an open system. Whereas if you look on the other side, a closed system is where you're not sharing with the environment. So if you have a system where everything is contained, or all the matter is contained in a bag or in a glass jar or whatever, you consider that a closed system because you don't have molecules leaving or coming in. Now, even in a very, very good closed system, you're still going to have some amount of energy in or out. And depending on what you're talking about, that may matter or not. So open system, things can go in and out. Closed system, everything stays contained. The next vocab or concept I want to talk about is the idea of a reservoir. So a reservoir is, the word itself is specifically talking about water, but when we're talking about it, we're going to apply the idea to a whole bunch of things. We're going to apply it to energy or to different types of molecules or whatever. But in general, it's going to be a place for storage. So a reservoir is where you can find a lot of whatever the thing is that you're talking about. So if in that top picture, if you're talking about data or information, so for example, this PowerPoint and the sounds I'm making are being stored on physical devices, on storage devices somewhere in the US or California or wherever, that are storing all of this information. So it would be a reservoir for information. So in the bottom picture, there's a reservoir of water. So that's where typically the word is seen as behind a dam. You have the reservoir where the water has all backed up behind the dam. So you have a supply and a place of storage of all this water that can then be used for generating energy when you need it. So it's the idea of having a whole bunch in one place. And so one thing to think about is when we think about energy, where do you store energy? What would be a reservoir for energy? So in a particular cell, you may think of, okay, what type of molecule is going to store energy? Well, ATP isn't very good for storing energy, so that probably wouldn't be the reservoir. So in general, a reservoir in a single cell would be something like the sugar, the glucose, or maybe fat is a good reservoir. So if you have body fat on your body, that's a reservoir of energy for your body to use when maybe you don't have enough food. And so we're going to be talking about reservoirs and how materials and things move or transported from one reservoir to another. All right, so here are our primary reservoirs of chemical potential energy. So if you need chemical potential energy, or if you are looking for where a lot of it would be found in the global system, in a large scale view, so not just looking at a single cell, but looking at the whole globe or an entire ecosystem or an entire biome, where would you find the most chemical potential energy? Well, the place that you'd find the most would be with the primary producers. So a producer is somebody who makes something, right? So, and if you think produce, if you get produce at the store, you're going to get fruits and vegetables, right? You're not going to get meat is not generally considered produce. It's produced, but it's not produce. And so the primary producer, so primary being the first, so who are the creatures, what are the organisms in the world that are the first ones to make the chemical potential energy? Well, it's going to be those creatures that do photosynthesis. And so plants, so grasses and trees and algae are going to be the primary producers. And the word you need to know is the word is autotroph. So autotroph means self-feeding. So if you know like a horse trough, a trough is a thing that animals eat out of, or a pig trough. So think of food, and auto is self. So it's self-feeding. So primary producers, aka plants, are autotrophs. They're self-feeding creatures. They take energy from the sun and they make their own chemical potential energy. They make their own food. They don't make the sunlight, but they are the ones who make it into chemical potential energy. They're the ones who go through that process of photosynthesis. And then everything after that does something different. And what they do is they consume something else for their energy. So the primary consumers are the first, so the primary are the first ones to consume something else. So primary consumers are organisms or animals that eat the producers. So for example, a deer will eat the grass. So it would be the first animal to eat the grass. So if a deer eats the grass, it would be the primary consumer. It's the one eating the autotroph. And because they don't make their own energy, so they're not self-feeding, because they feed on others, they're feeding on the grass, they're called heterotrophs. So hetero means other. Hetero is a word that will keep coming up again and again in biology. So when you think hetero means other or different. So heterotrophs are creatures that are going to eat or have to get their energy from somebody else. They're not going to make their own. And so, in the case of a food web or a food chain or an actual ecosystem, the way it works is you have the plants that are making the food, and then you have some kind of animal eating the plants, but then very often you have an animal that will eat the animal that ate the plants. And so that second level of consumer are the secondary consumers. So, for example, you may have a jackal or a wolf eat the deer. So if a wolf eats the deer, it'd be a secondary consumer. It'd be eating something that ate the plant. So carnivores are going to be secondary consumers. So herbivores, which eat plants, are going to be primary. Carnivores are going to be secondary. And then depending on the ecosystem, depending on what's going on, you may or may not have beyond that. So you might have something that eats the secondary consumer. Or so, for example, let's look at a prairie where you have the grass, and then a mouse might be the primary consumer, and then a snake might eat that mouse, being the secondary consumer, and then an owl might eat the snake. So an owl would be a tertiary consumer in that particular setup. Um, but the biggest thing to focus on is this idea of autotrophs make their own energy. Heterotrophs have to eat other creatures for their energy. Um, and we can think of these as, okay, if you wanted to find energy, where would most of the energy be? And because of the second law of thermodynamics, because every time energy changes hands, every time energy is used to go through chemical changes and change form, a lot of it ends up getting lost to the environment. So think about the size of these bars as being the daily amount of energy available in that group. So if you were to eat, so like each day, the primary producers make a whole bunch of energy, and then each day the primary consumers take in a small amount of that, like 10% of that. And then each day the secondary consumers are only eating a certain number of the primary consumers. And so as you go up and up and up, there's fewer creatures, and they're overall storing less chemical potential energy because that it's going through all these changes. There's less energy available in that group of organisms. So another way of describing this relationship between producers and consumers is calling them the trophic levels, so the food levels, the energy levels. And so obviously we're going to start with energy, so from the sun, or in very rare cases from the chemicals, but we're looking at it mostly from the sun, photosynthesis, and we have our primary producers, so our plants and animals. And then those plants are going to be using a lot of that energy, not just for making sugar, but they're going to be doing things like growing and making fruit and making seeds and doing all these things that plants need to do to stay alive. Plants don't look like they're being particularly active, but they're doing a lot of things. They are using the energy that they make. They also store a lot of it. But when you look at the energy that's stored, the reservoir, okay, the reservoir of energy, the primary producers are going to have all of it initially. But then, after they get eaten, a small amount of that energy ends up being stored in the reservoir of the bodies of the first level consumers, the primary consumers. So think of the 10% as being the size of the reservoir. So the primary producers, their reservoir is the base amount. It's 100%. That's the maximum a reservoir can be. So plants are always going to be the biggest reservoir. Then you have whatever is eating those plants, their bodies are going to use the energy that they eat for a lot of things, for moving and growing and reproducing and doing all the things that animals need to do to survive. But also, they're going to store, they're going to have a reservoir of a certain amount of that energy as fat or as proteins, as things that can be used for chemical potential energy for something else later. But a lot of that energy is going to be lost because of all the things they do as heat to the universe. So it goes off and it's not available. It's not a reservoir anymore. It's flying off into the universe. So the first level consumers, so the primary consumers, the heterotrophs that eat the primary producers, the autotrophs, those, though they're going to be a reservoir of energy that's at most about 10% as big, 10% as much energy available. If you were to go in and be a machine that sucked out all the chemical potential energy from all of the organisms in this group, you would only get 10% as much energy from the deer and the mice and the primary consumers, as much energy as you would get if you were to suck out all the energy from all the grass. So the grass is going to have, the plants are going to have a lot more energy available. And then going up from that, let's say you have secondary consumers. Well, because what they're eating is already way less energy than the plants, um, they only have 10% available to eat, and then they're using the energy to reproduce and move and hunt and do all these things. So the secondary consumers are going to have even less energy available. And as a consequence of that, if you look at just the number of animals, the number of animals is going to be much, much smaller because the more energy you have available, the more you can, the more offspring you can allow to survive. So if you have a lot of energy available, then you can grow and you can reproduce and you can have all these babies and all these seeds and all these things. But if there's not very much energy available and you had a whole bunch of babies, a whole bunch of seeds, a whole bunch uh, of offspring, but there wasn't enough food for them to survive, well, then they wouldn't survive. And so, as a result, as you go up these trophic levels, there's less energy available because they're only able to eat the energy that was made available to them in the bodies of the other lower levels. So a snake can only get the energy available that the mice already stored, but the mice don't really store that much energy compared to how much they eat. And so the snakes have very little energy in their bodies. And then going up to the third level consumers or tertiary consumers, like an owl, there are very, very few compared to the number of mice and snakes because they, again, can only get the energy that is stored in the reservoir of the lower level creatures. And so the number, the population size is going to coincide with how much energy is available at that level, and that's or at the level below them, and that's dependent on how many steps away from the sunlight have we gone. If you're really close to the sunlight, you can have lots of organisms. There's lots of blades of grass on the earth or in a field. But then compared to that, there's very few mice. And compared to that, there's even fewer snakes. And compared to that, there's even fewer owls. Um, and so it's just one way of saying, okay, as you go from organism to organism, all of these chemical changes are happening. All of this energy is being lost as heat because of the second law of thermodynamics. And so there's just a smaller reservoir of chemical potential energy. So let's just look at this in terms of an ecosystem. So on the left here we have the trophic levels kind of shown, and then on the right we have an example of a food web. And a food web you've probably seen since elementary school, and it's just a web of showing all these different organisms and how one will eat the other. Um, and so the idea is that the more hands, the more organisms that energy goes through, the less that is available to the next creature. So, for example, the trees or the plants here are at the center, and that's what everything is going to eat. So if you want the most energy, the biggest reservoir of energy is the trees. So if you can eat the trees or plants directly, then you're going to have a lot of energy available to you. But then the further away you go from that source, the less energy you're getting that was ultimately made by photosynthesis. So, for example, if a wolf eats a squirrel that ate the tree, well, that'd be being a secondary consumer. But then if it ate a snake that ate a frog that ate a bug that ate the tree, well, then that would be so primary consumer, secondary, tertiary. That'd be 4 layers of energy it went through. It'd be a quaternary um, situation where that compared to how much energy the tree or plants made, the amount of energy that the fox or wolf or whatever it is gets from that tree by going through that system is very, very, very small. Um, and so the closer you can be to getting the original source of energy, the better. But another thing that animals can do, rather than just being herbivores, which is eating the plants, another way of surviving, rather than just eating plants and being a primary consumer, is having more sources of food. So if your sources of food have relatively small amounts of energy compared to our relatively small reservoirs, then what they will do is they'll eat from a bunch of different reservoirs. So oftentimes, the higher up you go, organisms will have to eat a lot of different things. So, for example, a fox will eat snakes or bird eggs if they can find them, or squirrels or whatever it can find, right? Whereas oftentimes something that is an herbivore, something that is really um, close to the big energy reservoir, it may eat only one thing. So, for example, koalas in Australia, they only eat eucalyptus, and they can survive because eucalyptus plants make a lot of energy. So those koalas are able to survive on that. Panda bears only eat one type of plant, but that it's a plant they eat, and because of that, there's generally speaking a lot of energy available. So larger animals like humans and bears often are omnivores, which is they eat plants and animals. So if you're able to eat more things, a bigger variety, then even though that energy had to go through more hands, more sources to get to you, you're able to get some energy from each of them and still survive. Um, but again, the idea in general is the more layers that energy has to go through, the less available to the system, to the entire ecosystem, because at each stage, energy is being lost to the universe as heat, because each organism needs to reproduce and move and do all the things necessary for life. So just some things to consider that moving forward that hopefully you understand by now, but just kind of a self-check is think about why are there so few top predators in an ecosystem? So like mountain lions or bears. Um, you may live in an area where there are bears, and yet you may go years or maybe your whole life without ever seeing a bear in the wild. Even if you go on hikes and stuff, why are there so few of them uh, in, in their ecosystem? And then what is the benefit of being an omnivore, like a human or a pig? We're able to eat lots of different foods. What is the benefit to us uh, in terms of energy, in terms of the reservoirs available to us? And then think about the energy loss at each level because of the second law of thermodynamics. And think of the macro scale. So not just thinking of it in terms of a single cell or a single living thing, but in terms of the whole world, the whole Earth, how this plays out in drastically affecting those first two things of how because of this loss of energy, how it's affecting what can survive and where things can survive, and how dependent on a constant supply of energy everything in our world is dependent on. All right, and so just want to end on just kind of a happy, interesting note. So here we have some important autotrophs. So here I have pictures of one thing that you probably recognize and two that maybe you don't. But if you're interested in this, this is a great world of exploration that's very interesting. So obviously autotrophs on land are pretty familiar to us. We see trees and grass and things that are green are typically autotrophs. But in the oceans, which make the other half of our oxygen or more, there's other creatures that don't look quite the same. And so on the right, maybe that is more familiar because it's green. That's called a dinoflagellate, and those are creatures that will be at the top of the water and that do photosynthesis, in which the other microorganisms and fish and stuff they all eat that and get their energy. So those are the primary consumers. Another very, very, very important primary consumer are the ones in the middle, and they're called diatoms, Diatoms, and they are amazing creatures. They do photosynthesis, they take sunlight and make energy from it, but they don't have cell walls like normal plants do. They have very unusual skeletons, and I encourage you to look them up because not only are they beautiful and weird and interesting, but they're also very, very important to our world and ecosystems, and we'll be talking about them more later. So I hope this was helpful to you, and have a great day.